we're going to start the Finance Committee. Oh, not yet. Oh, sorry.
Recording in progress.
Good morning, everyone. We are going to start our Finance Committee. And can we start with the roll call?
Yes, we'll start with Committee Member Harmon. Here. Vice Chair Freeman. Here. And Chair Gutierrez.
Here. And is there any public comment?
Chair Gutierrez, no hands are raised.
Okay, so we will move forward with agenda item, water and wastewater rate studies revenue requirements.
Chair Gutierrez and committee members, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager, here today to talk about our utility, a water and wastewater utility, and some of the challenges that we've been facing. The last few years have been really difficult. We have been making steady rate increases, but nowhere near the magnitude that we've needed to keep up with the level of inflation that this community has been seeing. In the form of not only construction, that's been really hitting us hard, but we've seen about a 20% annual increase in construction costs, which has just outpaced anything that we could have expected. And then we've also seen almost 100% increase in our electric costs in the last 4 years. So just a compilation of things hitting us. And as you may be aware, we were also undertaking some significant investments in our capital infrastructure, which has been aging, and we have been diligent to tackle that. But of course, our expectations of the cost of that have gone up substantially. So I'm going to turn our presentation over to Ms. Cook, our Water Resources Financial Officer, and we look forward to a meaningful conversation today.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Let's see if I got this. Yeah, okay. It is on, right? Yeah, there we go. All right, Chair Gutierrez, Vice Chair Freeman, and Member Harmon. I am Gabrielle Cook, the Water Resources Financial Officer. I want to go over a couple housekeeping items. We have a lot of information to go over in 42 slides. And so we're asking that you hold your questions until the end so that we can get through everything. And then we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And then we're presenting the revenue requirement, which is the first step of the wastewater and water rate studies. And we'll be asking for a recommendation from Finance Committee to recommend to Council that we move forward with the next step of the rate study. And with that, I'm going to introduce our esteemed rate consultant, Mr. Sean Korn.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Ms. Cook said, I'll be walking you through our presentation this afternoon, talking about primarily the key rate drivers for the water and wastewater rate study updates. As Mr. Hagmark mentioned, we updated these several years ago. It's a continuous process that the city goes through to establish cost-based and proportional rates. And this is that next time to update them. We've joined water and wastewater together at this point, just given some of the challenges that have occurred with inflation, cost of construction increases as we've gone through this. So to start out, I'll walk you through an overview of the rate study. We'll talk about an update or a status of the rate study, and then we'll get into some of the key assumptions of both the water and wastewater studies. And then I have a couple slides right at the end just talking about those next steps and some of the key assumptions that go into the development of proportional and cost-based rates that we need to incorporate before you all see this again here in a couple months. So as we think about the purpose of a rate study, really as we go in, we have our guiding principles and goals, and it's really coming back and generating an adequate level of revenue to sustain both utilities on a long-term basis. In this case, we look out over a 10-year period with a focus on the next 4 years for a rate setting process through a Proposition 218 approach. As we develop our analysis, we need to incorporate the requirements of Proposition 218, which talks about being cost-based. So what is our overall revenue needs? How do we fund that? And then proportional, which really gets to the cost of service and the different rate structures that we have for our residential, multifamily, commercial, industrial type customers for both utilities as we go through this. Now, as part of that, we also need to take into consideration our overall financial planning criteria. So maintaining adequate reserve levels. We have council policies on what those reserve levels all are. You all talked about that last year, and those have been updated and included in this analysis, as well as adequately maintaining the infrastructure and overall debt requirements of each of the utilities. Now, we developed this based on generally accepted methodologies, but tailored to each of the utilities' specific customer and system characteristics. So thinking about what's the total production of water, what's the total wastewater treated at the plant, how does that drive our costs for the customers that benefit from both of those services. Mentioned the process. It's a 3-step process. For today's discussion, we're on the first step, the revenue requirement. It's establishing the overall revenue needs of each of the utilities on a standalone basis. The model or the analysis that we've worked on does have the cost of service, the requirement to meet the proportionality component, as well as the rate designs developed, but it all hinges, this is a sequential process, on our movement forward here based on our revenue requirement analysis. As part of this, we've met with the Water Commission 2 times, once in January, once in February. We presented the similar results that you all will see here in a moment. And we had guidance from the committee to move forward with the staff recommendation. Part of that was looking at our current capital plans and funding needs, as well as using reserves and dropping those reserves in the 4-year period below council target policy minimums, but hitting the target by our last year, which is fiscal year 2028. Since that time, we've worked diligently. Staff has internally, working with the finance department, other areas of the city, establishing and reviewing our overall projections over the time period. And we have been able to reduce the rate adjustments that you'll see this afternoon are less than what we presented to Water Commission in January and February. So we've done some work on the analysis based on some of the drivers and discussions that we had with the Water Commission. A couple of the key drivers that have been mentioned, Mr. Hagmark mentioned the inflation. That's both on our annual operations and maintenance expenses, as well as our capital costs, the cost of construction. And we'll get into some of the details of that here in a couple slides. Another driver is, specifically for the water rate side, is lower than average revenues. So you can see here in calendar year 2023, we had a reduction of 10%, or about $6 million less in the water fund than what was projected and budgeted as part of that process. And it could be in a similar level for calendar year 2024. Now, we budget established rates around a fiscal year. So what we've done in the analysis to date is based our assumptions on these most recent consumption levels for water specifically, which also plays into the wastewater side because we do have billed volume on the wastewater side up to that winter water cap, up to that hard cap of 8 HCF, 100 cubic feet. As we go forward, the rate revenues or the rates that the city charges for service are the primary funding source for the water and wastewater funds. So there's no transfer of funds from the general fund back into water or wastewater. There's no other taxing revenue that comes in. Rates are the primary driver. There's the vast majority in the 90 percentile, depending on grants and other income that come in as part of that. So that's an important component as we think about this when we establish rates through a Prop 218 process. These are our funding sources for our water and wastewater operating and capital needs. Jumping into wastewater, so diving into some of the details here. As we've gone through the process with Water Commission and what we're presenting this afternoon is we developed 2 capital plans. One was the planned capital, that's our option 1. And then we have our option 2, which is a revised capital plan. It shifts out or defers our capacity related projects into future years. So again, remember I talked about a 10-year period. We're focusing on 4 years for rates. We're shifting out the capacity projects outside of that time period. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. One is it's a consideration of ongoing capital projects right now. So El Estero Electrical, as well as Braemar Lift Station, and trying to combine staffing considerations, availability to manage these projects, implement these projects. And then the last part of that is on the capacity project side is updating the wastewater model to accommodate impacts of new state housing requirements. So the more dense, more urban impacts that we'll see on the wastewater system specifically here, and what that may mean as part of that analysis. So that capital piece on the wastewater side was really the key driver. What we brought to Water Commission in January looked like this. This is the full capital plan, so option one. It looked like we needed a 17% annually in fiscal year 25 and 26, followed by 12.5 and 12. And you can see those average customer bills increasing $10, $12, $10, $11 per month per year on top of that. As I mentioned, we worked hard internally, working through the projections, the assumptions, and really driven by those capital needs as part of this. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Hagmark for a couple quick discussions on the capital.
I just want to give some context to some of the capital work that's going on, and some of this may be some new information. The city was at one point in a consent decree based on sewer spills. We spent almost 10 years in a consent decree as a result of an inadequate spending and maintenance of our collection system. We have now gotten to a point where we're in good shape. We're now doing the maintenance work that needs to be done, but it isn't one of those things you check the box and you're done. It is a continuous commitment to doing that, to stay out of any type of legal action and to minimize our spills. And so we are diligently working, and as part of the proposed budget that we'll be getting into, we are not reducing funding for the collection system maintenance. We are deferring out some work to do some capacity improvements to allow us some time to do some more modeling, I think, to really refine that. And then the other thing, another big driver is the electrical work that we're doing at our wastewater treatment plant. It's nearly a 50-year-old electrical system, and at this point, we are buying parts off of eBay to keep it going. It has way past its lifespan, and it needs to be replaced. And it's been difficult. We've been in design now for almost 5 years. It is extremely complicated to replace the electrical and still be able to treat our wastewater to meet all of our regulations on a 24/7 basis. So a lot of planning going into that project. We've had a few failures recently in the electrical system. It is in need, and we are desperately looking forward to getting that construction contract going. But those projects are major drivers in maintaining, and we are funding those in this capital program that we'll be presenting.
So as we look at that capital plan, these bars represent the annual capital needs in each of these years. And so the black or gray bar on the bottom is our annual rate funded capital. That's the reinvestment in the system each year. And so you can see that increases over time. The goal there is to get that to reflect our annual renewal and replacement needs. So those things that have to happen on a reoccurring basis each year, we want to have those funds available built into our rates each year. So we're not borrowing for the things that we need to do every year. The blue bar is the use of reserves or available reserves. So you see that's fairly minimal. We use some up front, squeezes in the middle, and then we use a little in the out years. The green bars are what we are debt financing each year. So the first set of years in fiscal years 24 through 28, that is the El Estero electrical project that Mr. Hagmark just spoke about. That is how we're paying for that project, as well as the Braemar lift station project. So we're issuing low interest loans for those through the state revolving fund to fund that project. So that is a positive. We have a lower interest rate cost as part of that, or overall cost as we go forward. And ultimately, those are in the works, the projects. So we're incurring that debt service today, and then we'll start paying the debt service here in the short term as part of that. As we think about what that debt service looks like, here's our existing debt service in the blue, or the bottom part of the split charts, and the red on the top is our new debt service. Just as a note, the red includes El Estero and Braemar. So we're issuing or using those funds today over the next few years. We don't start paying that debt until fiscal years 26, 27, based on the repayment plan with the state revolving fund program. So another benefit of being able to transition rates over time to meet those needs. You'll also notice that in fiscal year 29, one of our debt service existing issuances is fully paid for. And so we have a reduction in that, and then we built back in that additional funding. So trying to keep a fairly stable and levelized overall debt service profile as we go forward. Now, summing all of our pieces together, this is a summary of our revenue requirement. So our revenue requirement is our overall O&M, annual O&M needs, operation and maintenance. So paying the bills, salaries, materials and supplies, chemicals, electricity, et cetera. Our blue is our rate-funded capital, so that comes from a couple slides prior where we need to fund our capital through rates, those renewal and replacement needs. And then you see the green is our net debt service. And we have a little orange in year one where we're able to put a little bit of funds away into reserves. This dotted horizontal line, or the dashed horizontal line, is our current revenue level. So that is our revenues at today's council adopted rates and our current number of customers. We have some minimal growth built in there. You really can't see it with the scale. As part of that, we actually only have that built into the multifamily segment, given some of the density and urbanization that's going on here in the city. But what you can see is as we get out 4 years, out in fiscal year 27, 28, our revenues at current rates don't even cover our current or projected operating and maintenance expenses. So we still have our annual debt service that we have to pay and our reinvestment in the system. So our goal here is to establish a set of rates and resulting revenues that'll touch the tops of each of these bars for the wastewater utility. Now, what does that look like? Here's those two options again. Option one is our planned capital. Remember when I talked about what we initially presented to the Water Commission, we were at the 17, 17, 12 and a half, 12. Option one is now 12 across the board with some of the work internally we were able to do with the projections and assumptions going forward. Option two, our revised capital plan, which is our recommendation, we're at 10 and a half, 10, 10, 9 and a half. Now you may be asking or want to ask me, why can't it just all be 10s? What happens is we gain that compounding on those rates. And so when we do that, if we lower that, we're not able to get to our reserve targets by fiscal year 28. So we had to do a little massaging there as part of that. You'll see down on the bottom half of the sheet that option two is the revised capital overall, and you can see that $6 to $7 per month per year increase based on those percentage increases. Now, this may not be the exact number you're going to see in April. We still have to finish the cost of service based on this, and we may see some minor proportionality changes as we go through that between the customer classes. So how do we break down that for the first year in fiscal year 2025? How do we break down that $6.43 or 10.5% average bill increase? You can see here in the chart, starting up on the left corner of the pie chart, salaries and benefits make up $1.84 of that. Allocated costs, which are costs that come back to the wastewater utility from the city. So these are support services to the wastewater fund, legal, HR, et cetera, that are included is $1.68. And then capital/reserves, with capital being the vast majority of these. Remember, there's two little slices of orange in our bar chart for reserves, is the vast majority of that. And this continues on average at about these levels over the 4-year period. Some minor changes. But you can kind of think of this as roughly 25, 25, 50, somewhere in that neighborhood of what that impact is, with capital being the driver, which is why, again, we came back to our option two, thinking about how can we prioritize our capital projects, how can we move this forward with staffing and the needs we have on the wastewater utility. Here's our reserve levels, ending reserve levels, bless you, on the wastewater fund. We start slightly above target based on the current estimates in 2024. We stay about flat in 25, and you can see by 2028, we hit that kind of right on the nose. We're right at our council minimum policy. And that is based on our target for O&M, as well as our capital target over this time frame. So again, when I mentioned we have the 10.5 to 10 and 9.5, it was to get those lines to match in fiscal year 2028 as part of this. But overall, meeting our targets for reserves. Absent rate adjustments, this is what reserves would look like. So remember, our revenue line was much lower than our total cost in the out years. That just compounds as we go out into the future. So obviously no adjustments, we would go negative within the next 3 years based on that. So to summarize wastewater, rate adjustments are necessary to fund our annual operating capital needs. We talked about a couple of the reasons, our inflationary impacts over the last couple of years that have been higher than average that we're catching up to, the continued inflation that we're seeing in some cost components today, even though the general CPI or inflation index is back around 3, there's still increases in other components of cost that the utilities are incurring. The prior rate study was projecting around 6 to 6.5 per year over this time period. So we are higher than that, but again, driven by our cost impacts on both operating and capital going forward. So jumping into the water side, excuse me, we have 3 scenarios for you this time. We're really going to focus on our second option. Again, option 1 was the planned capital meet council policy reserve levels each year of the 4 years. Option 2, just like the one we talked about with wastewater, we're doing our planned capital, but reserves dip down below our target. And option 3 was what can we do to try and minimize rate impacts going forward? And that really came down to reducing capital, specifically main replacements. That was one of our bigger drivers on the overall capital plan. We're coming back to you all with that recommendation of option 2 to meet our council reserve policies by fiscal year 28, as well as the need to complete our critical main replacement projects as part of that. And so, go ahead.
Chair Gutierrez and committee members, well, Mr. Korn pulls this up. I just wanted to talk about the main program. So we did in 2018 make a substantial commitment to move to 2% replacement of our water system because we were not keeping up with the needs of our system. Main breaks were increasing, and each one of those main breaks is diverting money away from main replacements because we ultimately are spending, like we'll show this video here, we spent over $1 million on repairing, not a new pipeline, but just repairing the damages from this one break.
Hill below McKinley got the first receiver. Finally brought in the backhoe there to be able to push some of this out of the way and clean it up as much as possible. A lot of mud in the middle of the street. Again, cleanup underway on Ladera Street in Santa Barbara after this water main break.
So, yeah, one of our more costly breaks that happened in the school, but the school is located above this development here, brought down the hillside. We had to...
That was unexpected, sorry.
We, yes, spent a lot of work. Repairing that hillside. There were cars that were damaged. Anyway, making that HOA whole, of course, took enormous amount of staff time as well, in addition to the financial impacts. This program, and here I just quickly, we've spent a lot of time at Water Commission talking about this, is this balloon payment that is coming. We have a lot of water mains that are reaching the end of their useful life coming up. And so part of that 2% goal was to get ahead of that, to kind of head off these major interruptions. We're spending around $750,000 a year right now on main breaks, just responding to main breaks, and that ignores the impacts to our community as a result of that. It's just city staff time and expenses, and that is only going to get worse if we can't continue to make that 2% investment. And that is why the Water Commission felt strongly with option 2, which did not have us delaying water main spending. In the past, I'll be honest with you, this was the go-to place. Anytime we ran into any economic hardships, let's just cut the main program. And I think we've kind of gotten to this point where we can't go there anymore. If we do, we're really just burdening the future with even higher costs. And so for that reason, they felt strongly with staying with option 2, which kept full funding for the 2% main replacement, which the challenge has been, in the next slide, cost increases. And this was just mind-boggling. I had staff pulled this out. This is the cost per mile since 2000. We were paying just over $1 million a mile. Bids came in a week and a half ago, $2.7 million a mile. These are local contractors. These are jobs right here in town. So this isn't money going to some other community. These are people working right here. but these costs are going up enormously, and we do have plans to sit down with these contractors and talk more with them about how do we put more cost controls on this, because we did try. We're buying parts for this next project because we thought we could get a better deal on parts than the contractor could, and it helped, but clearly not as much as we were hoping it would help. And so definitely need to sit down with our local contracting community and see what we can do to help improve this situation, because this is just, untenable if it continues at this pace. But it's about 20% a year is what we've seen.
And just as an adder to that, this is not a Santa Barbara only issue. This is actually a nationwide issue, but I'll focus on the West Coast. It is a challenge. We had a very similar slide about a week ago at a similar type of meeting, and their costs more than doubled, more than what we're showing here in their case. And so this is an industry challenge right now that everybody is facing as we're going through it. And it's not, we focused in on the main replacement because it is one of the larger capital components, but it's with all capital projects. I mean, it happened a bit on the El Estero Electric when we talk on the wastewater side. Just the cost of doing construction today has increased, and there's a lot of folks trying to get to the, I'll call it the bottom of this, of what's driving some of those key increases. So when we looked at that initial analysis with the Water Commission in January and February, we were looking at 16% in the initial year, 12.5%, and then dropping down. As I talked about with wastewater, the commission asked some really good questions, as well as some of the key drivers. And so we did dig into those since that time. We've been able to bring this down a bit as part of this, but that's one of the key assumptions that we looked at was that capital plan. So this is our option 2 capital plan. So we've got, again, our dark or black gray bar at the bottom. That's our rate funded capital. That's the reinvestment in the system. Part of the goal here over this 10-year period is to get that rate funded capital to a level where it supports at least our main replacement program over time, so that you have those funds on a continual basis over time to fund those. We do have some reserve use here. It's in the blue. We do have a grant in fiscal year 2025. You see the little sliver of orange in there. But then we're debt funding projects. The first few years, fiscal year 25 through 29, that is the Vic Trace Reservoir project and the Cater Reservoir. Thank you. Sorry, I knew I was going to forget one of them. So those are the 2 primary projects in the short term on the on the water side as we go forward that are being debt funded. So very similar picture here. One of the benefits on the water side is we do have a couple of our existing debt issuances being fully funded and paid for over the next several years. So you can see even with the existing debt, the blue bar, you can see how that drops off. The red bar with the proposed debt with that initial payment for those first few projects we just talked about, Vic Trace and Cater, coming into this, keeping a fairly levelized debt service at our current levels today. And then our total revenue requirement. So again, summing up our operating and maintenance expense. So the black bar at the bottom, the blue is our rate funded capital. That's our annual reinvestment. Some reserve funding in there as well. And then our annual debt service. You see that stepping up as we go out over time, as we showed on the last slide, but just minimally in the out years as part of this. Again, we have the dashed current revenue line. So you can see today that's funding all of our expenses for the revenue requirement, both operating and capital. As we start going out into the future years, again, you see that starting to lag behind as we have those additional funding needs for both operating and capital on an ongoing basis. So here is the results of the 3 options that we looked at. Option 1, basically the same as what you saw from the January Water Commission meeting. Option 2, we've been able to bring that down to the 12.12.99. Again, I'll show the reserves here in a moment. It's kind of that stair step to be able to meet our target reserves. And then the reduced main replacement, being able to bring that down, but again, deferring that important critical capital need as we go out over time. So overall, as part of this, we're looking at the changes on an annual bill. Again, these will be revised and finalized as we continue to move forward with the Finance Committee and the full council as we go through the final rate study process. So what makes up that overall $13.65 change? You can see capital and reserves, again, the vast majority being capital, is about 2/3 of our total increase in our costs in fiscal year '25. We've got a little sliver there of our operational costs and salaries and benefits. Again, our allocated costs, the costs coming back from the city to support the water utility. And then that slight increase in the debt over into the future. So again, key driver here, as we've talked about for both utilities, is really on that capital side, coming back and maintaining that critical infrastructure and service that you provide to your customers. Here is the reserves, ending reserves for the water utility. Coming back, you can see we start right at our target. We dip down as we use reserves to fund both operating and capital needs. And then with that rate transition assumption for option 2, then we get up to our reserve targets by fiscal year 2028. And again, the decline if we do no rate adjustments and the impacts that that would have to reserves over time. So to summarize, on the water side, our rate adjustments are necessary as we spoke. We have our inflationary increases in O&M and capital, as well as the critical capital needs. We've had changes in some of our costs on the allocated cost side going forward, as well as the increase that we explained on the annual main replacement, as well as other capital as part of that. Again, as a point of reference, we were looking at 5% adjustments. On the water side, this was done couple years before the pandemic hit, before we had some fairly significant inflationary impacts, which is why we're kind of getting up above those here as we move forward. So to summarize the water and sewer rate adjustment, here are the combined. These are not additive, so we don't add 10 and 12, and it's a 22% rate increase. I'll show you what that bill impact looks like here in a moment. But that drives our overall adjustment. Here is that average city bill, which includes water, wastewater, solid waste, and the utility tax. And so the blue on the bottom is our water, the green in the middle is our wastewater, the yellow is our solid waste, and then we have our UUT. Just as a note, the solid waste is a preliminary estimate of 2% for single-family homes coming up here. That's going on a separate track. We'll be coming back to the Finance Committee as well as the full City Council on their timing, as well as us coming back with water and wastewater. But what you can see here is the total change in the monthly bill for a city's customer is $22.09, which is actually a 9.1% increase, which is why I made the comment on the prior slide. We can't add those percentages together as part of that. And so that would be that impact for fiscal year 2025 going forward. Obviously, these will be refined, but that would be the overall projection. One of the other good questions and discussions we had during Water Commission, well, what is that impact to a multifamily customer? This is a little bit more of a challenging discussion because many of the majority of our multifamily customers are served through a single meter, and that bill does not go directly to those customers. This would be a multifamily customer that has an individual meter, which are a smaller amount of actual living units within the city's customer base. But you can see that based on the proposed rates, as of today, the overall adjustments, that would be an $11.37 increase per month. So about half of what the single family change is. Part of that is driven by the use of water for individually metered multifamily customers. They use a little less than half of what an actual single-family home uses, just giving, it's mostly indoor use, right? Many of the multifamily complexes have an irrigation meter, a separate meter for other outdoor use components. So to summarize our next steps here, going forward on the cost of service, as I mentioned, we have the analyses developed. Some key components here is looking at how and why you incur costs for both utilities. Water, we're looking at that use of water, the peaking, the demands placed on the system. Wastewater, it's the amount of wastewater and the strength, or how hard it is to treat that wastewater. And then we need to proportionally develop that. Now, the wastewater cost of service is looking good. It's moving forward fairly effortlessly. One of the challenges on the water side is how we establish the tier pricing and how we allocate costs based on the water supply. And that's driven by several years ago, I believe 2017, Council adopted the prioritization of water. And that's what this slide here shows. is our different water supplies. So going down the right side, we have groundwater, surface water, state water, which is our purchased water, and then desal. The left-hand side, you have your different customer types or the tiers. So as an example, if you look at 3 lines down, it's tier 1 single family, and then you go a couple more into priority 4, it's tier 2 single family. And that council prioritization has driven how we establish the water source, and it goes from cheapest to most expensive to the different customer classes of service. So as an example, irrigation agriculture, which only uses just over 1% of the total water on the city system, has the cheapest water with groundwater. Then our single family and multifamily get the next cheapest water, which is a blend of the cost of groundwater and surface water. Then if you jump all the way to the bottom to tier 5, our tier 3 for single family and multifamily, or tier 2 for all of our other customers, which is that next level of use for on the water side for each customer, that is all at the desal rate, which is our more costly water. So we do what's known as resource stacking, and based on the council prioritization, we've allocated these costs out. So this is a key driver because costs have changed since the last study. How you've incurred costs, just from an operating perspective, as well as how customers are using water and where that water source is coming from. And so we've gone through an update to this, looking at the overall approach. As a side note, recycled water is kind of off to the side here. It has its own source. It's not part of the prioritization, but they do have their own costs associated with providing recycled water. The last component is our fixed versus volumetric rates. So remember, when we look at our water and our wastewater rates, we have a fixed charge and a consumption or volume charge. And the overall goal here is to establish proportional and cost-based rates through the cost of service. But one of the things that lower fixed cost does for us is it helps us on our affordability for those lower water use customers. And it also helps maintain a conservation-based rate structure. Now, the disadvantage of having lower fixed costs is that the vast majority, we're estimating about 85% of our costs are fixed. So all of our salaries, all of our benefits, all of our labor, all of our capital, debt service, that's all going to occur whether or not we sell a drop of water or treat a drop of wastewater going forward. But we recover our costs on the inverse. Historically, that ratio has been 30% from fixed and 70% from volumetric. At this point in time, we're not recommending changing this, but this is an important discussion as part of the cost of service analysis of what we're going to recover from rates as we move forward. Now, one of the approaches that staff is evaluating, they're also going through a water affordability study, which I'll touch on here in a moment, but as that program gets more traction, more movement, has some defined areas around it, we may come back and look at increasing that fixed charge when we have a program to offset those costs to those lower use customers as part of that, as a benefit, as part of that process. So it's a bit of a balancing. It's one of the challenges with Proposition 218 is we cannot subsidize one customer for another. So we have to have a different funding source for any type of customer assistance program as part of that. A little update on the status of the water affordability study that staff is going through right now. That was initiated in spring of 2023 with the Alliance for Water Efficiency. The Water Commission has received a couple presentations, October of 23 and January of 24. Staff has held numerous public engagement opportunities. There's been some public meetings. There's been a survey gone out and a draft report comment period. So that's ongoing and closing up here shortly. And then the final study's expected in the spring of this year, coming up here soon. And then really the draft summary here is the city's a leader in supporting water affordability, but there is room to improve. And that's one of the things we talked about in tandem with the rate study of how do these two mesh together and what options are out there for the city to consider as we move forward. And so next steps on the affordability study is presenting those final results to the Water Commission, and then staff developing and prioritizing those actions and review and discuss with the Water Commission, and then bringing that back to the City Council this summer here of 2024. And next steps for the rate study. Again, we're the second one down, Finance Committee here, City Council. I hope you appreciate this. We'll see you here in a little bit again. Same presentation, sorry. But we'll walk through this process with you all. Then on the 5th, March 5th, there'll be some more information brought to City Council. March 21st, we're going to the Water Commission with our proposed water and wastewater rates. So that's why today is so important, is to get that feedback from you all as well as the full council, so we can finalize our analysis and develop those final proposed rates. And then in April, go through this process with the final proposal, the Prop 218 notice, gain that feedback and direction, mail those notices. We have a public webinar scheduled in May, as well as the final public hearing in June, and then adoption, if approved by the council, in July overall. And with that, I will turn it back over to Chair Gutierrez for any questions that you all may have.
Public questions first? Anybody have questions?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, and thank you. This was an excellent presentation and very efficient. Really, really appreciate it. I do have quite a few questions, but I think Vice Chair Friedman's probably going to ask most of them. So I'm going to stick to what I think are really the most important 2, maybe 3 questions for me. And the first will surprise certainly not our finance director. It has to do with our reserve policy for these funds. Can you remind me, Mr. DeMartini, what is our established policy for the water and wastewater reserve funds? Is it 15%?
Yes, Committee Member Harmon. So the city's reserve policy includes not only the general fund, but also the enterprises. All the funds have the same disaster reserve requirement of 15% of next year's annual operating expenditures, and then 10% of contingency reserve for a total of 25%. However, the water and the wastewater enterprises do have some additional reserve requirements related to their capital improvement program and their debt service requirements as well. So their reserve requirement level is a little bit higher than 25%.
And is that the debt service and the capital reserve requirements, that's like a third sort of bucket? We've got the 10 and the 15 and then 5 or whatever, what is it?
I don't have the exact percent.
Yeah, I can answer it if you like. So for the capital side, it is the lesser of the next year's capital, next subsequent year's capital, less debt-funded projects. So all those green bars we took out, we don't want to have a reserve for something we're not having to pay for. Or the percentage of assets going forward. And so in this case, for both water and wastewater, the next several years less debt is the lesser of those 2 checks, and that's what we've used in those charts that we had shown there.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm certainly convinced, and I'll try to not make too many comments in asking this question, but I am convinced by the need to continue to invest in our capital infrastructure. That was a Mr. Hagmark case very well made. That video is quite poignant. But as I continue to believe our reserve requirements are simply too high for where we are as a community. And my question is, if the council were to take an action to reduce our reserve requirements, not that bucket as it relates to debt service and capital improvements, but potentially as it relates to our disaster reserves, that 15%, what would be the implications for the rates if we were to take that action today or next week, whenever it is? Because I'm seeing we get back to a fully funded reserve in 28. If we can reduce those requirements, can we sort of concomitantly reduce the costs that we put on residents?
It will have some impact on those percentages. They will come down, although it will be only focusing on the disaster contingency side of it is the smaller component of the reserve targets. And so it won't have a significant impact, but it would bring those down overall. I don't have a number for you, but that's something I can
In theory, we
get.
could do either, though. I mean,
Yep.
I'm saying personally, my preference would be not to touch the debt service, that 5% bucket. But of the other 2 buckets,
Yep.
either or both, if those were to be reduced, there would be some implications for what we would have to pass on to customers.
Yes.
So one of the challenges, and we're happy to look into this, but one of the challenges is we just got done being audited and our rating improved. And that does help. So they look at how much money do you have on hand in the event of emergencies. And in some cases, some agencies have a year's worth of money on hand. We're nowhere near that. I think we're carrying 3 months.
Correct.
About 3 months of cash on hand. If we just all of a sudden couldn't get a bill out, all our reserves added up is enough to continue to pay our bills and do work for the next 3 months. And that's kind of a minimum threshold in the water, wastewater utility sector. But what's really challenging, and I just want to let you know, is that the funding sources, so the SRF, State Revolving Fund, has been just an amazing source of funding, 1-2% interest loans. There is so much competition to get that money now that we're uncertain on some of our future projects whether that money is going to be there, which means we're going to have to go to the bond market, which means that rating becomes extremely critical to maintaining some level of interest rate. And I don't know if Mr. DiMartini wants to speak more to that, but that is something we're kind of balancing with this, but we certainly aren't carrying a unusually high amount of reserves.
And I could just add just briefly to it. I agree with Mr. Hagmark. And the other thing that's noteworthy as well is with recent disasters that we've had with the floods and the storms, our water and wastewater infrastructure has incurred damages. And yes, we will likely get FEMA and or Cal OES reimbursement, but it will take quite some time. And the ability of getting reimbursement from disasters, the time it takes has just been going on and on and on. So that's why we have disaster reserves. We have used those disaster reserves in the last 2 years due to the storms, and those reserves do go down because of that reason. Eventually, hopefully getting reimbursement, but that will take some time.
Thank you.
And this last year was a really good example. Because it was so wet, our customers reduced their water usage because they didn't need outdoor watering. Our revenues dropped off by $6 million, and at the same time, we experienced all that damage in the backcountry. We had to replace some critical log booms. That was $2 million in Gibraltar to get the road open. I mean, we had probably a good $3 to $4 million going out to just deal with the January 9th storm events and subsequent storm events. So it quickly seems like it can go from everything's okay to all of a sudden it flipped over. So having those reserves is really important to being able to stay afloat and I think maintain a good bond rating.
I really appreciate that, and I hear that argument and very much respect it. I continue to believe that there is a middle ground that we could achieve here between gutting the reserves, which I would never advocate for, and reducing them at the very least in an effort to communicate to our residents that we understand their own disaster reserves are also being depleted month after month. And I think certainly it's a balancing act. I would not want to impact us on the bond market, but I hear that every time we have this conversation, and I think at a certain point we risk people not being able to pay their bills, and that would be a problem for us as well. So I'll say more about this later, but I would really like to see, if there's the will from council, I guess it would have to come from the council at this point, some analysis of what that middle ground might look like and what the impact to the residents and the ratepayers would be. That's of significant interest to me. So I will leave that there. And then my second question, it's just such a great irony to me that the wetter it is, the higher your bill is. I mean, I can't really get over it, actually. It's horrifying in terms of communicating. So my second question is really about communication. And I see in the schedule, we're going to mail rate notices, and we have a plan. But, and maybe this is for you, have there been any really sort of creative, innovative communication plans around rate increases? Because I don't think this is going to be enough, and times are really, really tough, and this is a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a more focused effort over the last 3 or 4 years, really kind of started right before the pandemic started actually, and then it ramped up or amped up during the pandemic as folks were having to raise rates, where they have put more focused effort in there. And I think, right now, the city does, or Water and Wastewater has, communications consultant on board that's going to help with all this. So we were actually talking about that this morning of, okay, here's where we're going. What's that message going out that we need help with? So there will be additional information other than just those going out. as part of that, and I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that part.
Yeah, we glad we have Katz and Associates, who we have on contract. They help a lot of different utilities with this kind of messaging, and we'll be leveraging all the different media platforms that we have to try and to get the word out. But at the end of the day, it is a tough message, no matter what. And we are very fortunate, and I wish we had time to get into the water affordability study that's currently wrapping up, because it was also really empowering to seek the community's input. And again, what we're finding from it, there are particular parts of our community that are going to be hit harder with this. But with that, we found that honestly, a lot of people's attention was focused on their rent, which was going up $200 or $300 a month, not their water bill, which may be going up $20 a month. So it's important, but it was interesting. Like, it really seemed like there needed to be a much bigger program to address, electric costs going up 20%. There's just so many different factors, and it seemed in our correspondence that most of the community was really focused on the rent issue or cost of housing, which seemed to always dwarf these other ones, but they add up.
There's a tsunami
It
coming.
is, right? There's just
The
a
wave
lot.
isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And for my final question, actually gets into that a little bit. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you all came up with and how this affordability study has evolved. But one of the questions that came up for me, and I may have misunderstood sort of how the subsidy programs might work, but there has to be a separate source, I get that. But with multifamily, where there's not usually individual meters, it doesn't mean that those residents are not being charged the increases. Of course, they're passed on to the tenant, but presumably because there's no individual meters, those people would not be eligible for the subsidy programs, and they're likely among the residents who are most in need of the subsidy. So will that study address that sort of inherent conflict that we have? Has anyone addressed that? I mean,
So
Big
Member
question.
Harmon, the study does address that, because we specifically called that out. We were like, the people most likely to be struggling in this community are living in multifamily. And right now, 70% of our multifamily do not receive a water bill or
I
utility
don't,
bill.
and I live in multifamily.
And that's despite having an ordinance since the 80s requiring metering, individual metering of dwelling units. It's just our housing stock is pretty old, and the cost to upgrade that housing stock to get it metered is a big hurdle. So they do address that, but we would be leading the charge. There is not a lot of agencies. It's a really difficult thing to go after, because not to say it's impossible, because they do say, I mean, there's ways in which we could, credit the I wouldn't say HOA or property owner, and then somehow make sure that credit is showing up in their rent. But typically what we were finding, and what I was finding at the water conferences, is that the challenge is most people are just raising the rent because they can. Not because their costs are going up or the water bill went up. It's because that's what the market will bear. And it seemed to be a huge disconnect, but I think as part of this, we want to drill into what more can be done to help out the multifamily, because we see that truly as the place of need.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. I'm really, really happy to hear that. And just to echo that, I mean, I think many people would probably say, yes, excuse me, rent is my biggest concern, but rent is my biggest concern, but I don't get a water bill either. It's included, So I think it's very difficult to really parse out where each of these things is coming from. But the fact that you're really thinking about this, and I even just hearing you talk about it, it's way more complicated than I had imagined, but I very much appreciate that, and that's critical. So I will leave it there and turn it over to my more able colleagues.
Councilmember, Vice Chair Friedman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation, and appreciate all that went into it and the work the Water Commission did as well to get us to this point. I have a few questions, and it was a good line of questioning, I had some of those same questions about multifamily and all that. But the first are more general. One is just as we're looking at these studies, there's been changes in the for potable reuse. That was out there. What is the status of that, and how does that play into this?
Yes, in December, the state approved regulations for direct potable reuse. There are, and I would recommend we kind of wait and see. There are numerous agencies that are moving forward with that. Ventura is one of those. But if you've been watching the news on that, that project has ballooned from $150 million to $500 million. And it was basically producing the same amount of water that our desal plant is, which we paid $72 million for. So it is, I can't, someday it will be another supply for the city. I don't see it in the next 10 years needing that water right now. I think we've got a good investment in desal. It's expandable. And so I think we're good with that commitment. But I certainly see this community at some point doing that. And when it does, it's going to be a hefty financial lift to do that.
Thank you. I know it comes up a lot now, especially with those changes, so just wanted a quick overview. The other, just because I've seen some articles out there about why we're not using Measure C to invest in water infrastructure and others, but I just wanted to clarify that since it was in the presentation, but these are enterprise funds, so they are revenues that come in, whether it's the rates or grants or whatnot, but it's not tax-driven, and Measure C is a tax. Is that correct?
Yes, Vice Chair Friedman, that is correct. I mean, Measure C and the general fund in general, it can be used for any governmental purpose, right? But those funds are not plentiful, right? And they pay for core public safety services, parks and recreation, library, and many other functions. The water and the wastewater utilities run like a business, and so they're an enterprise fund. So they have more flexibility. They have the ability to set rates to cover not only their annual operating costs, but also their capital investment, which was the bulk of today's presentation. And so the water and the wastewater enterprises do not receive any tax revenues for any of their operational or capital programs.
So that's one of the reasons why we stick Measure C for the general fund purpose of revenue. So I want to, if you could pull up slide 28. So I just have some questions. So I'm interested in, so the option 3. So it is, none of us is in an ideal situation. These are very high increases for everyone, and so we want to do our diligence to try to keep them as low as possible for all our customers. And so there is this option 3 is up there, and as was explained, that option 3 would mean not doing the replacement for the mains, and I think you made the case for why that's not a prudent investment. So my question is, if we were to go, say, with option 3 to try to keep the rates low, but we wanted to continue to make the investment in the capital, are there other types of revenue outside of the rates that we could use, such as general fund or Measure C? This is more, I guess, for Mr. DeMartini. And what would that mean? And then in terms of what's out there, what are the implications of it, and would you recommend some of these or not? And if not, why not?
Sure, Vice Chair Freeman. So yes, there are those options are out there. So there's general fund, as we talked about earlier. There's Measure C, but as Council has seen in prior budget processes, and you'll see in the next couple of weeks, all of that funding is already currently accounted for, right, for those core sort of general funded functions. And so staff would not recommend using any Measure C or general fund dollars for the water or wastewater enterprise. There are some grants out there, but again, those grants are few and far between, and I don't think they would really make a dent in sort of the core work that needs to get done in these operations. Staff has talked today about being able to utilize the SRF program, the State Revolving Fund. But as Mr. Hagmark indicated, there's some risk with being able to secure adequate funding for our capital financing going forward. And if we had to resort to go out to open market to issue private debt for those projects, it would be much more expensive, which, yes, there would be a little bit of cost savings up front because you're not using cash up front to pay for those projects. But we would all be dealing with that for many years to come because the annual debt service payments would be much higher than an SRF. So other than that, those are really the other options, the other sort of levers for the council to consider for pulling up or down, or just continuing to maybe consider delaying other capital investments. But as again, staff indicated, if you delay that now, it's only going to be more expensive going forward.
And so again, with option 3 here, which is a little less, there would be upfront savings immediately on the bills, but all the levers we have to pull would ultimately probably cost us more in the long run, which would necessitate on the tail end probably larger increases down the line.
I think that's a fair assessment.
And then if we were to use, say, Measure C to invest in the water main replacement and one with the lower, you'd have the same problem with projects capital, especially in our roads, our infrastructure, that's a majority of Measure C goes towards that. So that would be delayed, and you'd have the same types of issues that we're dealing with the water main replacement, where if you don't replace it now, it becomes more effective. We're trying to get our pavement condition index up, and as we've seen. So any of those levers would help us with water rates, but then we would fall behind in other infrastructure that is needed that the public uses every day as well. Okay, thank you.
I just have one question. On slide 22, the main replacement planning, how many of our city pipes need to be renewed?
Well, it depends on the time frame you're looking at. I could spend a lot of time on this. So what we have in our system that is cast iron. There's about 50% of our system is made up of cast iron. A large portion of it was installed between 1890 and 1960s. And ironically, the 1910 stuff is actually better than the 1950 material. So it's not built at the same quality. And what we're finding is that our 1950s cast iron post-World War is not holding up well. And it is reaching the end of a useful life. You can expect about 80 years of service out of those. And so that is that balloon payment that is coming. And that's what we see. That's what broke at McKinley School. That was a cast iron pipeline. And as I described them, they do really great. They go through these cycles of, cold water comes into a pipe, they contract and expand, and they do great until all of a sudden they just go. And leads to some pretty massive damage. And so that is the balloon payment that we're looking at. And obviously you can see what there was a trajectory to actually replace more than 2%, but we're trying to strike that balance. We had been on a 1% trajectory, and we were just kept seeing main breaks keep increasing. And so for the first time, we've actually started to see our main breaks start to dip. We were at one point over 100 main breaks a year. We're down in the 80s now, but that leads to other unintended consequences. Most of our operators can't afford to live here in town, and so being able to respond at night to do those main breaks is further complicated. So the faster we can get after this, and I'm going to say the faster, on this pace, trying to get a hold of it so that at least in 20 years, our community is not burdened with this really high number of main breaks is really what we're trying to get after.
So the increase on the water rate, it has a domino effect. It's not just we're going to increase the water rate because we have to it's not just the maintaining of the water, but it has, the salaries and we have a very, very old infrastructure of the city, and it has a lot of consequences like the McKinley if we don't address it. Let's say if we go to option number 3, what's a big consequences if we end up going to option number 3, let's just say, because we want to be able to help the consumer. What are some of the consequences if we even decide to go to option number 3? I just want the public that watches these meetings, they're just looking into how much, my bill's gonna increase every month. And yes, like Councilmember Harmon said, it's, especially after the storms we've had, it just doesn't make sense. But if we can explain to the public, we have a bigger issue than just, we have to, maintain the water rates, and for the cost, I just want the public to understand that there's more to this issue. And how many of these, of what happened down in the McKinley Hill, can we see going on in the city in the next 10 years?
Well, that's what we're trying to avoid, right? Because I think we have started for the first time in at least 20 years, we've started to see water main breaks go down, and that's because the council made the decision to go from 1% to 2%. So we're starting to see us starting to make some progress. If we start to move away from that, I mean, we're currently spending about $750,000 a year. And again, that's just city costs, not the impacts to our community, but those costs would go up. And so the money that we actually had earmarked to replace the mains, we're now having to spend to clean up and repair where it broke. And it just ultimately eats away at the progress that you can make with main replacement. And I think that's really kind of the challenge here. You start losing progress because we're spending so much on reactive maintenance instead of proactive maintenance. I mean, that's the best way to do it. And as I mentioned earlier, I can't say this about all construction that we do, but one of the things that does local is water main replacement. We found that it's really the local contractors who are getting that work. And so as frustrating as that cost increase are, that money is staying local. It's putting people who live in this community to work. It's whether it's paving, whether it's lunches for the workers that are working here. These are people who work and live here, and I think that's helps at least to swallow the huge costs that we're seeing going on here.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay. Do we have public comment?
Chair Gutierrez, no hands are raised.
Thank you. Comments? Yes. Councilmember Harmon?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Thank you again for this. This is a very difficult topic. It's difficult both conceptually and also difficult emotionally. So very much appreciate the thoughtful approach to this process. It makes things a lot clearer, and it's always going to be difficult. So really, really appreciate it. I also want to say the water main replacement, that the newer stuff is worse, is just so interesting to me. Like, I thought planned obsolescence was a modern phenomenon, but apparently not. So that's very interesting, and I think will be helpful as we communicate to people some of the challenges. So all of this goes into sort of allowing us to move forward. First, I will say that option 3 is for me personally off the table. I am, as I said before, convinced by the necessity to continue to invest in our infrastructure for the good of our residents today and our future residents. So option 3 is off the table. I am also, option 1 is untenable for reasons I think you all agree with, seeing as you recommended option 2. But here's where I continue to get stuck, and it's on the maintenance of our reserve policy. And I know that I am just beating this drum until nobody wants to hear it anymore on every issue, but I would respectfully request that my colleagues consider that when we send this to council, we ask them to consider requesting some information related to what it might look like to reduce by some amount. I'm not saying gut it. Again, I want to be reasonable, but I would like to see what that looks like to have some level of reduction in our reserve policy. And the reason that I ask that is because, well, $20 a month may not feel like a lot in comparison to the incredible rent increases we're all dealing with and the cost of groceries. It adds up. And as I said before, every family I know has had to reduce their reserves in response to the ever-increasing prices. And communication on this issue is already going to be so difficult. I really think that if we can show that we are responsibly, that's the key. I mean, I'm not advocating that we go to 0% by any means. We've got to do it responsibly so that we do have some leg to stand on if we have to go to the bond market. But I think it would go a long way in showing residents that we understand how challenging it is to survive month to month in this community. We get it. And I think just that gesture of goodwill, while still truly being responsible with our future, seems a good compromise. And so, again, I recognize that reduction's not going to take a $14 increase down to $2, but every little bit helps. And I think that even with the disasters that we've experienced, we had this conversation 6 months ago, right? Like, all of our disasters, it's never been more than what we've had in our reserves. So I think we can come up with some responsible decrease in that policy that will allow us to pass on those savings to our residents. So I guess what I'm saying is I would propose that we support option 2 for council and also request that they consider requesting of staff some analysis of what that reduction might look like and how it would impact the rate increases to customers. Thank you. And sorry for creating more work.
Vice Chair Friedman?
Thank you. Again, thanks for the presentation. I'll just be brief. I think option 3 is off the table as well. Option 1 is too high. And like often, I feel like I'm with that 1970s Steelers wheel song, stuck in the middle with you. And so all day. But I think option 2 is the responsible option. We need to communicate to the public as well. So in terms of the reserves, and I appreciate that being raised because I think it is an important point. And I'm fine with forwarding that for a discussion for the full council this afternoon to consider. The one thing I would like to have is if we did do the study, say the council moves forward with that or do an analysis, I guess, is that it would also include the other side of it, that with the state revolving fund being more competitive and we might have to go to the open bond market, what are the implications if we were to reduce our reserves on our ratings and with that? So I'd want a full 360 because I think the case could be made if you reduce it, you might have that small incremental there where every step counts, but the impacts might be felt down the line if we have to go out to the open market and then you end up having to increase the rate. So I'd like a full 360 of what that would be on it. Just so we get the information, I think it's always worth it to get the information that Member Harmon is requesting because then we can make the most informed decisions. So I am supportive of option 2 and we'll go from there.
Thank you. I'm also supportive of option number 2. Thank you again to staff. I know all of the hard work that went into this presentation. And I do like Ms. Harmon's suggestion and the backing of Vice Chair Friedman to have an analysis of our reserve. And do we have any, that's it, right? No more public comment?
Chair Gutierrez, I think we need a motion from a committee member, but also to clarify if you want to support option 2 for both water and wastewater, to send that to full council, please. Thank you.
Do we have a motion on the table?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will move that we forward option 2 for both water and wastewater to the full council and request that council consider requesting an analysis of a reduction of the reserve policy and what that might look like.
Second.
Can we get a vote?
Yes, the motion was made by Committee Member Harmon, and it was seconded by Committee Chair Freeman. We'll start with Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
and then Vice Chair Freeman,
Yes.
and then Chair Gutierrez.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
We have come to an end of our meeting. Thank you.